Good afternoon, everybody. This is Chris Judge at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, coming to you from the Native American Studies Center. This is our W. Brent Bergen Lunch and Learn lecture for May. Before I introduce today's speaker, next month, on the 28th of June, we will have Dr. Jody Barnes from the Department of Natural Resources in South Carolina. She's going to give a lecture called Identifying South Island John Doe and the Archaeology of a Gullah Geechee Fishing Village and Osteobiography. After Hurricane Irma, a skeleton was found on a piece of state property, and she's been trying to figure out who it is and if any of his descendants live nearby. Today, I'm excited to introduce a colleague of ours from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte Peter Ferdinando, who's an assistant teaching professor in the Department of History there. He has a PhD from Florida International University and an MA in anthropology from Florida Atlantic University. So he has a due focus in the historical and archaeological records, which serves his interests in erasing the pre- and post-contact boundary and telling Native American history. His current book project, Rich from the Sea, Indigenous Wrecking and Maritime Trade in the Atlantic World, is what we'll hear about today. He's examining Florida coastal Native Americans, adapting their existing maritime skills as an effective strategy to exploit Spanish, French, English, and Dutch vessels dashed on the rocks and reefs, Florida's east coast, during the 16th and 17th century. So please make welcome Dr. Peter Ferdinando.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Chris. It's very good to be here at the Native American Studies Center, or at least here virtually. And yes, today I'm going to be talking about my current project, Rich from the Sea. I'm going to focus on the indigenous wrecking component of that, although certainly there's a big aspect of maritime trade as well. And what I'm going to start with is this piece here by a Spaniard, André de San Miguel, writing in 1595. And also this really cool map, one of my favorite maps that kind of shows you've got Cuba there, you've got the Bahamas, you've got Florida going up into Georgia and South Carolina. And this kind of centers us on the area where I look at this indigenous wrecking, this maritime trade. So, okay, André de San Miguel was a young Spaniard who was shipwrecked off the coast of what was then Spanish La Florida. Today, it would have been coastal Georgia. He'd left from Havana on a ship. There'd been a storm. Some people on the ship had taken the ship's boat, but some of the survivors from the shipwreck were able to get to St. Augustine and back down to Havana again. And it's that trip back down by André de San Miguel and others from St. Augustine to Havana, where he records Native Americans coming out to trade with this passing ship. And so I'm going to start with just reading a few pieces from that to kind of situate you in what is happening on the coast of Florida. And so he says that, quote, "From the time we left the port, canoes of Indians were constantly coming out to meet us with things to trade." He adds that, they always set out long before we reached the coast opposite them. And although we never waited for them, their canoes were so swift that by the dint of rowing, they always overtook us. And they would shout, lower the sails, turtle, turtle, fish, fish, amber, amber. And so there's this existing trade where Native Americans would canoe out to passing ships and trade fresh supplies, fresh fish, fresh turtle. Amber in this case is ambergris, a product from sperm whales that's used as a perfume fixative and other things like that. And then he continues on, André de San Miguel, along with the fish, the turtle, the ambergris. He mentioned specifically that the Native Americans brought sets of ship's nails. And this piece always kind of stuck out to me because the Native Americans of coastal Florida, they're definitely not smelting iron to produce ship's nails. Their technology was a shell-based technology. they did a little bit of cold working of metal, but the idea of them producing sets of ship's nails wouldn't happen. And so I was always intrigued, well, how are they getting these nails? How are they assembling them? How are they essentially getting ready to then bring entire sets of them out to passing European ships? And the answer is quite simple. It's indigenous wrecking, one half of my current book project. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about what that process is, this indigenous wrecking process, and kind of bring us back around to how the Native Americans were able to acquire not just one or two, but again, entire sets of ship's nails. So my current book project then, Rich from the Sea, I use an ethno-historical approach, contact era written documents, and archaeological artifacts to examine this kind of multi-century story of how Florida's Atlantic coast Native Americans adapted their existing maritime skills to exploit these European shipwrecks and then go out into the Atlantic world to trade those salvaged shipwreck goods and also other maritime products like the ambergris I already mentioned and the fresh foods they were bringing. And ultimately, this process of indigenous wrecking of maritime trade enabled the indigenous people of this Atlantic coast of Florida to maintain sovereignty, maintain control over their maritime economy while exploiting the new realities of the emerging colonial era. Now, this indigenous wrecking process, I divide it into three pieces: recovery, preparation, and distribution. And I very much want to stress that this was a deliberate process. This is not momentary salvage, but what's very clear looking at the primary source accounts of indigenous wrecking is it was a deliberate process, a stable process, multiple centuries, where the Native Americans would recover materials from these shipwrecks. They prepare those materials to meet indigenous standards or European standards, and then distribute them back out to Native Americans in Florida, the Spaniards in St. Augustine, or passing European ships. So again, this process of recovery, preparation, and distribution. And I do want to point out, I'm certainly the one who's kind of developed these three parts. This is not something that's evident in the accounts. The Native Americans of coastal Florida didn't necessarily envision it in these three distinct ways. But part of my argument really relies on this being this kind of deliberate, well thought out approach, because in many of the primary sources and some of the historical works written using those sources, there's been a lot of focus on kind of initial violence and not so much on this long-term goal. And so what I want to show you here is a painting showcasing one of these shipwrecks that I'm going to talk about, in this case of English Quaker Jonathan Dickinson and the passengers of the crew of the Reformation that was lost on the Florida coast in 1696. And when Jonathan Dickinson wrote his account of this, he very much highlights kind of violence. He discusses how when the Native Americans first arrived at the shipwreck, only a few hours after the wreck, he said that, quote, they violently seized the first two of our men they met. The Native Americans were very furious and bloody. Later on, when the full, hundreds of Native Americans arrived, he continues to say they were furious in manner, dismal aspect. The Native Americans were foaming at the mouth, according to Dickinson. And then he relays this account that's essentially the interpretation you see visually on that screen there, where the Native Americans are going to raise their large Spanish knives, as he calls them, and Dickinson and the rest of the party are waiting for them to execute their bloody design. So very much this focus on violence in the moment. And that is very clear, not only from what Dickinson says in the account, but even from the title. The title of Dickinson's account includes the fact that he gets this remarkable deliverance from the cruel, devouring jaws of the inhumane, and then it's a nice bigger letters, cannibals of Florida. there's one of the title pages of his multiple republished account. So very much focusing on kind of violence, savagery, cannibalism. And that bias in the primary sources kind of fed into the history a little bit. There's a historian who worked early on in the 1940s on the Florida coast Native Americans, including the Ais, a major group there, who kind of brought that in a little bit. And while he certainly pioneered great work on the Ais, this historian, Charles D. Higgs, kind of brought in some of that flavor of Dickinson, where he talked about the murderous wrecking and salvaging operations of the recalcitrant Ice Indians. And so one of the reasons why I really stress this as a deliberate process, as a well thought out process, is to contrast it with what you see in a lot of the primary sources and some earlier historians' work. Because I don't see just the violence in this image, and there's certainly going to be violence. This was a violent well. But what happens in the moments after this image is the Native Americans, in fact, take those large Spanish knives, as Dickinson called them, lowered them, quit their places behind each of the people, and asked the English to unlock all the containers from the ships, from the Reformation. And the English, having just been through this episode where they feared for their death, they acquiesce. They unlock all the containers. So in this case, the Hobe Native Americans can get all these goods out. And so a lot of times, this is not recalcitrant cannibals wallowing in violence. The Hobe at this moment used just enough implied violence, enough threat of violence to get the English to do what they wanted, which was to unlock the containers and begin the recovery process, the process of salvaging material from the shipwreck. And so that's why, again, we're going to have recovery, preparation, distribution, starting with recovery. What do you get from shipwrecks? Native Americans recovered some precious metals, gold and silver, other precious metals and jewels. But many of the English, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch ships lost on the Florida coast would have had clothing and cloth, lots of sail material. There had been lots of chests and containers, lots of metal tools, metal fittings, and the nails of the ship too. So lots of useful material. And to kind of help you see this recovery process, I'm going to use two particular accounts today, one of which is that Jonathan Dickens account I've just mentioned from the 1690s. I'll also be using an account by the founder of Pedro Menendez, founder of St. Augustine. It's about him. It's Pedro Menendez de Avalos. He experienced a shipwreck in the 1570s on the Florida coast. And the account, it wasn't written by him, but about him by another of the castaways. And so from 1570s to the 1690s, this process of recovery is going to be very, very similar. So then here we are on the Florida coast. We're going to be looking at, as I said, the shipwreck of Jonathan Dickinson and close to the Hobe, and then the shipwreck of Pedro Menendez close to the Ulame. And what you see on the screen then of the Atlantic coast of Florida, those are two major areas of shipwrecks. In the Florida Keys up to about today, what would be Miami, and then a stretch to the central east coast below Cape Canaveral. According to the Spaniards, who are based in St. Augustine, those are the two major concentrations of shipwrecks, with the Ais in the upper concentration there being particularly dominant, and the Gulf Coast Calusa also getting access to those shipwrecks. Okay, so with that preliminary kind of setup and geography set, let's talk about what happens with Pedro Menendez and Jonathan Dickinson. So this is a recovery process. Now, the Native Americans were well aware of what happened during big storms, that there would be shipwrecks. And so in both accounts, it's very clear the Native Americans were out looking for shipwrecks. Both accounts, the Native Americans arrive early in the morning to review the scene and try to take charge. And so with the shipwreck of Pedro Menendez in 1571, the record says it was about dawn when the Ulame first came upon the Spaniards. And when they arrived, they looked at the Spaniards, they looked at the shipwreck, and then they went away again. And the Spaniards did not quite know what they were doing, but they were obviously concerned. And what the Ulame were doing was going back to their village and gathering a large number, hundreds of people, to come back. During that time between when the Ulame reconned the wreck and the large party comes back, the Spaniards build a makeshift fort out of some of the boxes and containers from their shipwreck. They even put a little artillery piece on top of it. And so one of the people writing this account notes that when the Ulame arrived, they, quote, saw the fort, the cannon, and the company ready for battle, and they did not dare do anything but carry off the booty. So the Ulame saw the Spaniards ready to fight, saw the goods being washed out of the shipwreck, and decided just to go recover the goods, leave the Spaniards alone, who took the opportune moment to leave. They walk up to St. Augustine, and there we go. In 1696, with the Englishman Jonathan Dickinson and those castaways, same thing happens. It's early in the morning. It's about 8 or 9 in the morning that the Hobe, a couple of Hobe, come up to the English. The English, however, don't develop this kind of more action-based response. They decide to simply tell the Native Americans they are Spaniards, because they hear that the Spaniards have some play over the Native Americans in Florida, and they don't otherwise resist. So these two Hobe come up to the English, recon the English castaways and the shipwreck scene, and then go back to their village. Now, in this case, the main Hobe village is about 5 miles south from where Dickinson's ship, the Reformation, was wrecked on the Florida coast. Those Native Americans, they originally got to Dickinson Party about 8 or 9 in the morning. And about noon is when this large group, several hundred Hobe, come running up. And I do want to point out kind of the speed here. So the first recon was 8 or 9 in the morning. They recon the scene. They go back 5 miles to their village, gather hundreds of other Hobe, come back up 5 miles. And it's within 3 or 4 hours this all happens. So this is a well-oiled process. They know exactly what they're doing. And when the Hobe get back is when they seize the English. They do that whole business with the large Spanish knives and get the English to unlock all of the containers, all of the chests. And Dickinson then records what the Hobe did. He records the fact that they start pulling out certain goods. They recover a large amount of cloth and clothing, and they lay it all out along the seashore, on the sand, so it dries in the sand. They open up all the containers that they want. They don't break them. They open them up, salvage the goods they want. He's also specific that the Hobe leave certain goods behind. They don't take the rum, the sugar, the molasses, the beef, or the pork. They leave that, but they take the clothing and the cloth and the sail material. They take the gold and the silver, the coinage, and they take those containers. They use those containers, those chests, to carry goods off the ship and then the 5 miles south to their village. And in the end, the Dickinson account is very clear of the speed, not only the speed of the party getting back up by noon, but Dickinson records that it's by noon on the following day, the Hobe had recovered everything they wanted from the ship, and they burned it after that. So in less than 2 days, the Hobe had recovered absolutely everything they wanted. They burned the ship to the ground, to the floor timbers, Dickinson says. And the reason they do that is certainly a bit to hide the shipwreck. Other more influential Native American groups or the Spaniards might want a share of what they recovered. But also by burning the ship, letting it cool for a little bit, it makes it a lot easier to get all the iron nails and other metal implements on that ship, recover those. And so from this process is how they get access to things like sets of ships' nails that they recover, and then again later on will go out and trade with passing ships. So this recovery process, whether it's in the 1570s, the 1690s, the Native Americans take charge of a scene quickly, recover the goods they want, leave the goods they don't. They don't smash the chests and things open. They use them to carry goods back to their village. If they can capture Europeans who would be valuable to trade to the Spaniards at St. Augustine, they do. If they can't, they let them go on. And that then sets the stage for what happens next, which is the preparation component of this process. So recovery to preparation. And again, you already saw a recovery. It was well thought out. They had this kind of well-practiced approach. Same thing happens with preparation. Preparation is where the Native Americans are going to modify their recovered goods, sometimes to meet indigenous standards, the standards they want, sometimes to meet European standards because they're going to trade it, the salvaged goods, back to the Europeans. And we're talking about things like the repair of containers that did get broken, the modification of European clothing, sometimes into breechcloths, sometimes to join clothing together to certain lengths. And there's in fact going to be a indigenous Spanish exchange rate on the amount of cloth. They also recover ships' boats and sail material, and they modify metal goods too. So preparation of containers. One of the things that, again, is very clear from recovery, but it comes into preparation too, is the importance of salvaging the containers, the chests, the storage material from these shipwrecks. And the Native Americans not only recover those to carry stuff back to their village, but one of the things they have the Dickinson castaways do when they bring them to Hobe, their main village, is they actually have the English repair the locks that were broken on some containers. So not only do they want these containers to help carry goods, but they wanted lockable containers as well, which are of course very useful to keep your goods locked up. Along with the containers, there was a lot of clothing and cloth recovered. And the clothing, as I've mentioned, sometimes they modify it into indigenous style breechcloths. And this is something that is recorded in a number of primary sources. The English, the Spaniards, the French all mention the Native Americans would take clothing, rip it into smaller pieces, and use it as breechcloths. But they also kept some European clothing intact. And there are several archaeological excavations that have found kind of buttons and other things arranged in such a way that suggests certain, especially high-ranking Native Americans, the Calusa chief on the Gulf Coast, may have been buried either wearing the European clothes or with European clothes placed over them. And it's the buttons that often survive. So sometimes they'd modify the clothes, sometimes they'd leave them intact. Another thing the Hobe had the Dickinson party do was join cloth together. And this one always interested me because it kind of seemed like a bit of a strange thing to do. You get different pieces of cloth, sailcloth and other cloth, and join it together. But then later on in the Dickinson account, there's a brief reference to probably why they're doing this. And it's the fact that the Native Americans on the Atlantic coast had informal exchange rates with the Spaniards. And they'd give the Spaniards a yard of linen or woolen or silk in exchange for a leaf or half a leaf of tobacco. And so there was this set exchange rate of about a yard of fabric for a leaf or half a leaf of tobacco. And again, there's only few references to this in some of these accounts. But this sounds like, again, a process that is well developed, well established. A certain amount of cloth in exchange for a certain amount of tobacco. Another thing they prepared would be kind of boats and sails. And one of the things that's fascinating with the Dickinson account is the Hobe let Dickinson and his party use their ship, the Reformation, that ship's boat, and they use it to go up the Atlantic coast on the way to St. Augustine. But there was another English shipwreck from the same convoy that Dickinson's Reformation was in. It was called the Nantwich. And the Nantwich's ship's boat also survives. But the Ais, a group further north, they don't give that boat to the English castaways. They've sunk it in the local inlet. And one of the reasons why I speculate they might do that is they knew the Spaniards would be coming down. The Spaniards will come and trade for shipwreck goods and things like that. And they didn't want the Spaniards to necessarily find that boat. But as soon as the Spaniards did come and learn from the English shipwreck castaways that this boat existed, the Ais were able to get it back up and refloat it. And in fact, Dickinson records that not only is there the Reformation ship's boat, the Nantwich's ship's boats, but he points out there are several other, as he calls them, English canoes, one of cedar, the other of cotton tree, like those of Jamaica. And so it seems the Native Americans on the Atlantic coast, the ships themselves, they're not so worried about, but the smaller ships' boats are very useful, akin to a canoe. And on top of that, there's tangential references in several accounts, including Dickinson, to the possibility that the Native Americans of Florida's coast were also using sails. And this is something that, again, is not well documented, but certainly might be something where they're able to recover sail material and prepare it into either these ships' boats or their own canoes. And I'm going to read a little piece from Dickinson again here, where he's talking about, as they're going up the Atlantic coast in the Reformation ship's boat, they saw a sail to the eastward. And it was a canoe or a boat with two masts and a sail. At this point, they think they're rescued. They think sail, it must be a European ship. But as soon as the ship saw them, it bore away, and it ends up going to a Native American village on the coast of Florida. And so looking archaeologically at kind of the recovered canoes from Florida, there do not appear to be any kind of indigenous sail making pre-contact, but little snippets like this suggest that the coastal Native Americans of Florida may have been recovering, perhaps repairing at least a mast or two with some sail to use on the Atlantic. And again, there's only occasional references to it. It's a piece of this book project that I want to work on a bit more. But it certainly seems intriguing from what Dickinson, again, said. But there's one final area I want to spend a bit of time on with preparation, and that is metals. One of the things that's fascinating is when you talk about indigenous wrecking, the shipwreck of Spanish, of Dutch, of French, of English ships, a lot of people go straight to, as they see it, the treasure, the gold and the silver. And certainly the groups of Florida's East Coast are going to recover that gold, that silver, that precious metal. But they're not necessarily going to see it as particularly more valuable than some of this other material. And in fact, what we'll see is they actually prepare it for a number of indigenous uses that will build on earlier indigenous culture. And so I'm going to talk about these, what are called ceremonial tablets, in a minute. And I want to remind you, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Native Americans of coastal Florida, they're not going to be smelting metals. This is cold work, cold hammering, and this is where a lot of the archaeology comes in. So the Native Americans, along with the cloth, the clothing, the sails, the boxes, the ship's boats, they also recovered metals, including coins, including silver bars and gold bars. And they cold work some of these into various shapes. The coins, especially Spanish coins, they'd oftentimes form into beads. They'd essentially put a hole through the center of the coin and form it up into a bead, and then have long strings of coin beads. And this works with the existing kind of bead culture of the Native Americans of Florida. Pre-contact, they wore a lot of shell and coral beads. In the contact era, they traded with the Spaniards and other Europeans for glass beads, amber beads, resin and crystal beads. And they also produced these metal coin beads. And the reason they did that is because beads showcased status, influence. Andre de San Miguel, the Spaniard shipwrecked on the coast that was then coming back south. He notes, for example, that the cacique of the Tequesta, the chief of the Tequesta, he was, quote, stood out from the rest because of his spirit and nobleness, and also the many beads which he adorned his person. So they produced these coin beads, and again, they just put a hole through it and kind of bent it around, cold hammered it around to form the bead shape. But one of the most intriguing things the Native Americans made from recovered, again, gold and silver, other shipwreck metals, is what you see on the screen there. These are called ceremonial tablets, and they appear to be based on a pre-contact design made out of wood. At the top there, the top left is kind of one of the wooden versions. And then you can see some contact era ones made out of silver and gold. There's about 50 or 60 of these known. Unfortunately, most of them were excavated without kind of professional archaeological work. So we sort of roughly know where they're from, but very little of the stratigraphy, the exact timing of them. But from what's been recovered, we do know how they're produced, how they're prepared. And the Native Americans would take a piece of salvaged metal, sometimes coins, sometimes silver bars, and they'd hammer it, cold hammer it flat into roughly a rectangular shape. And then they'd incise these lines, these designs. They'd also make sure that there's a suspension hole somewhere you can attach it, because these were worn. And these designs, there's been some really interesting work done that kind of showcases some of the designs on these tablets are very local, based on kind of stylistic animal designs, where some of the designs appear connected to the wider Mississippian world as well. And so again, they're preparing these, in this case, to indigenous styles, because when it comes time to distribute these shipwreck goods out, sometimes they go to other indigenous people, sometimes they go to the Spaniards in St. Augustine, and sometimes they'll go to passing ships. And that is what we'll move to now, is the third part, the distribution. So they've recovered the goods, they've prepared them, and now is distribution. And again, that's distribution to other Native Americans in Florida. That's distribution to the Spaniards of St. Augustine, and to passing European ships. And once again, archaeologically, it's clear that there were existing exchange networks in Florida. In the middle of the state, you get things like marine shell, shark's teeth, and there's contact era documents reference to the movement of dried whale meat into the interior. And then in the interior, they produced what's called the bread of roots that moves to the coast. So there were existing exchange networks. that then in the contact era developed more with these various salvaged goods. So let's take us back to our map here with the ice leading in that concentration up near Cape Canaveral, and the Calusa of the Gulf Coast being kind of a leading influence for the lower group where the Tequesta and Matacumbe were located. And so at first, there's distribution to other Native Americans. The Calusa, for example, are recorded by Fernando de Escalante Fonteneda, a Spaniard held captive by the Calusa. He records the Calusa as getting silver and gold and other things from the Ais and from the Florida Keys Native Americans. And Escalante Fonteneda also mentions how groups like the Ais are, quote, rich from the sea, since many ships have been lost there. He says the Ais have up to 1 million or more in silver bars and gold and other things of jewelry made by the hands of the Mexican Indians. And he talks about how they distribute these goods out to other Native American peoples. But when the Spaniards established St. Augustine, they get pulled into this exchange network. And what's really fascinating is that this exchange network, the Spaniards keep it relatively quiet because they don't want the king to know, because they're getting gold and silver from the Native Americans. They're also getting ambergris from the Native Americans. And in fact, when the king, in this case, it's Philip II, finds out in the late 1590s about what's going on, he's quite upset about this because, at least from the ambergris, he should have been receiving the quinto, the king's fifth. And to kind of give an idea of the amount of exchange between the Spaniards, St. Augustine, and the Atlantic Coast Native Americans, when the crown learns about these trips backwards and forwards, Native Americans bringing goods to St. Augustine, Spaniards heading down the coast to exchange with the Native Americans, the king asks one of the Florida officials to keep track of the voyages. And over a 2-year point, there are reportedly 25 trips down the coast by Spaniards to the Native Americans to trade for materials lost from shipwrecks and for ambergris. And this Spanish official in Florida mentions that that's just the official trips. There are lots of illicit trips as well. So there's this well-established back and forth. And sometimes it's Spaniards going down the coast. Other times it's Native Americans going up the coast. Dickinson again mentions Native Americans who are planning to go to St. Augustine, exchange in ambergris and other things like that. And kind of most impressively, there's a later account from the early 1700s where a Spaniard mentions that Native Americans from the Florida Keys come all the way up to St. Augustine to bring amber and other goods to trade. That's about 300 miles if you go up the coastline. And so again, these are well-established exchange routes with the Spaniards of St. Augustine. So to kind of help you visualize this, you've got distribution going everywhere, distribution going into interior Florida, distribution going up the coast of St. Augustine or back down with St. Augustine ships. And then also distribution going out into the Atlantic Ocean, which is of course where we started with André de San Miguel, who had discussed the Native Americans canoeing out. But that wasn't an isolated incident. In fact, the Native Americans canoed out all the time to meet passing ships. We had André de San Miguel in 1595 tell us that, from the moment he left St. Augustine, the Indians were constantly coming out to meet. And other Spaniards report the same thing. There's another friar, Gregorio de Escobedo, who references the fact that Native Americans hurried out to passing ships. Even when those ships wouldn't stop, they would always catch up with them and exchange goods. But 100 years later, in the 1680s, an Englishman, Edward Barlow, mentions the exact same thing. Canoes coming out to English ships in this case, and exchanging goods. And so this process, this indigenous wrecking process of recovery, preparation, distribution, not only stays remarkably stable through time, but it's very clear that there are multiple kind of avenues. Other indigenous people, the Spaniards, St. Augustine, and also then passing European ships. Which kind of brings me then to take a step back here. I want to kind of step back to the wider Atlantic world and kind of tell you why this indigenous wrecking process sort of matters. Because it's very much about indigenous wrecking, maritime trade, part of a kind of far wider story about Native Americans' active engagement in the kind of emerging Atlantic world. Not just the emergence of the colonial era, where it's European ships going around. In this case, Native Americans in canoes are coming out to meet European ships and trade with them. And I'm going to sum up that thought in just a minute, but I want to take one moment for a tangent to tell you one story that I think really showcases Florida Native Americans and this trade, but in this case, a slightly different direction. In 1698, an Italian visits Havana. While he's in Havana, Florida Keys Native Americans arrive. According to the Spaniards, it was a 24-hour canoe voyage. So they left from the Florida Keys. They took 24 hours to reach Havana. And this Italian recalls, as he calls it, the merchandise that the Florida Keys Native Americans brought with them. They brought fish, they brought turtle, same things we saw with Andre de San Miguel. They brought a little ambergris as well. They also brought caged birds. So Native Americans from the Florida Keys in a canoe, a 24-hour voyage, were all the way to Havana with fresh fish, fresh turtle, a little bit of ambergris, and caged birds. And the account in this case is very much telling the story sort of in a mundane way. It just was a regular thing that happened. Nobody in Havana seemed amazed that Florida Keys Native Americans took this journey. They exchanged these goods and went away again. And so these kind of relatively uncommented on trades, exchanges, show us something about kind of the wider Atlantic world. And this is ultimately where my work, I think, fits in along with a number of other historians. We're beginning to look at Native Americans, cultural, economic, social exchanges, not as being kind of temporary or one-sided, but these long-term processes. And so, for example, my work on the Tequesta, the Matacumbe, the Ice, the Jove in Florida with indigenous wrecking, maritime trade. Or some of my colleagues like James Hill, he works on the Creek and how they built a maritime diplomatic network with Cuba and beyond. Or Andrew Lipman, who looks at the Wampanoag and the kind of saltwater frontier they helped develop between the Dutch in New Netherlands and the English in New England. Or Matthew Behar, who's got a really cool book about Wabanaki pirates. They steal English ships and use them to raid English settlements. And all of these projects have in common that it's Native Americans on the Atlantic actively involved with the emergence of this wider Atlantic world. And that's ultimately what kind of brings me back into this project, my project, Rich from the Sea, because the colonial world, the Atlantic world, was not a place of vanishing indigenous agency. Rather, what we can see from Florida's Atlantic coast and all those other projects I mentioned is active engagement with that Atlantic world. And in my case, Florida Atlantic Coast Native Americans adapted their existing maritime skills to exploit these European shipwrecks dashed on the reefs and the rocks. It wasn't some momentary salvage, some murderous wrecking and salvage, but it was this deliberate process, recovery, preparation, distribution, a stable process across multiple centuries that took in not only the Atlantic coast indigenous people, but other indigenous peoples of Florida, the Spaniards of St. Augustine, and again, those passing European ships. Thank you.
Great job, Peter. Very interesting. If anybody has questions, as Ashley just put in the chat, if you'll type them into the chat, I'll serve them up to Peter. While we're waiting for the first question, my colleague Jim Spyrick, who's a maritime archaeologist here in South Carolina, is searching for the flagship of Lucas Vacrez de Alleon that's sunk in Winyah Bay. And they've been working for a long time and they have not found very much. And I'm wondering if the local Native Americans got the nails and got the hull jars and everything and burned that wreck and took the nails. So I'll have to pass that on to him.
It wouldn't surprise me. And although a lot of the accounts are kind of very much based right in the beach, right on the littoral zone there, although I don't talk about it in this project so much, the Native Americans of Florida's coast were able to dive 30, 40 feet down. And in fact, some Europeans kidnapped some of them to use on wrecks in the Caribbean, where they were, again, 30, 40, 50 feet down. So they certainly may have salvaged material, even if that wreck wasn't too close to the coast.
And I imagine that was a skill acquired over a long period of time.
Oh, yes. Major maritime skills. One of the things I didn't talk about, but I certainly could if people want me to, the Native Americans of Florida hunting whales is an almost unbelievable story, but there are so many accounts that tell the same story that it has to happen this way. It's really quite something.
Is that where they canoe up and put a plug in the air hole?
Exactly, yes. Yeah, they literally will canoe out, they lasso the whale. One Native American jumps on the back, holding on to the lasso. They have two wooden plugs to plug up the blowhole. They hammer them in with a hammer, and then they kind of play the rope out so that they're not going to lose the animal. And then it essentially suffocates, and they drag it back. And this is how they make that dried whale meat that they then trade with the interior. And there are multiple, there's like a half a dozen different Spanish accounts. And one of the things that's fascinating is several of them start with kind of a phrase, something to the effect of, "You will not believe this, but it's true." So the Spaniards were amazed by this whale hunting.
Yeah, I remember reading those and being amazed that they're pounding it into pemmican and trying to pound it in pemmican, and that trade went well into the interior, I guess, as a delicacy.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody got questions? We've got a fantastic in all caps presentation from Laura Black.
Well, thank you.
I don't see any other questions. And when do you hope to complete the book? Do you have a contract?
I'm actually working on 2 chapters this summer, and then we'll be sending material proposals off then. I would hope to have a complete manuscript by next summer. One of the things that's intriguing with this process is trying to balance the contact era documents with the archaeological artifacts. And so that's taken a little while because some of the things I've worked on have been useful for the project, but funnily enough, probably won't appear in there fully. One of the cool things I did was I GIS'd a bunch of the metal artifacts, and there's been some really intriguing patterns that don't quite fit with this project, but I know I want to save for future things. And so there's been a lot of kind of spin-off pieces that are intriguing, but I need to focus on this and not keep going down rabbit holes.
Well, it sounds like very fantastic research and very interesting evidence for something that I had never heard of until I saw your title. And so thanks so much for coming and giving us a lecture on it today.
Of course. Well, thank you to everybody for saying nice things in the chat. Thank you to Chris, and thank you to Ashley and the Native American Studies Center. I very much appreciate a chance to share my research. I think it's really important to look at, again, this kind of emerging Atlantic world, this colonial era, for the entirety of it, which includes, again, not just occasional mentions of Indigenous people, but their very active involvement in this maritime world. So certainly, I'm always glad to share this info.
Excellent. Well, listen, come see us sometime. We'll go to lunch. I'll show you the center, and good luck with your research this summer, Peter.
Well, thank you very much.
All the best.